Hi everybody, this is Brendon Baillod from the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group. Thanks again for joining me for another video. Tonight I've got a real special one in store for you. I want to tell you a little bit about some really rare antiquarian books that I've acquired recently. Many of you know that I deal in rare and antiquarian Great Lakes books, and I have a large research collection of them myself. But most of them involve the exploration of the Great Lakes, the early exploration, the 1600s, 1700s, and early 1800s, and the period of American settlement. And I have a particularly interesting book tonight that deals with one of our earliest shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, the loss of the Griffin. So many of you are familiar with the works of Louis Hennepin. Hennepin was the Recollect or Franciscan priest who accompanied La Salle, actually one of 3 or 4 Franciscan priests that accompanied La Salle on his exploration journey down the Mississippi in the period 1678 to 1682. And Hennepin wrote really 2 books that detailed that exploration and his experiences with La Salle. There's some of the more important sources we have, but not the most important source. The most important source we have probably are the actual letters of La Salle himself. And those are, I actually have those here in a 2-volume or 6-volume set from the Pierre Margry, who was the curator of the Ministry of Marine and Colonies in France in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And he made it his life's work to collect all of La Salle's original letters about his explorations in the New World. And they appear in this ornate set. They're in French. They've never been translated to English for the most part. But as you can see, this is an original set. It's got the original fold-out maps in it. This particular book is from 1870, the set is. And what's special about this particular book, even though it's in French, is that it has a really excellent letter written by La Salle in his own words, where he details what he was told by his 2 men who he sent to circumnavigate Lake Michigan in hopes of finding out what became of his ship, the Griffin. And the men came back with a lot of information. They actually brought wreckage from the ship that they had picked up on the northern coast of Lake Michigan to show him. The letter is very detailed. It was written in 1680, exactly 1 year after the loss of the ship. And so it represents the most primary source we have about the Griffin and about La Salle's remembrances of what happened to her. The letter was sent to France to one of La Salle's creditors, and his purpose in writing it was really to explain why he hadn't been successful in descending the Mississippi and had to return and make a second attempt, which was ultimately successful. But so this is a really interesting book set. It was written in France. Less than 500 copies were ever made. It's believed that less than 100 copies ever came to North America. I acquired these from an antiquarian in Quebec City. They are some of the only copies of the full Pierre Margry set about La Salle's work in North America. One of the other interesting sets I have is Father Hennepin's books. These are his new discovery of a vast country in America. This is the first reprint from 1903. These books are currently fetching way more than they used to. I was shocked when I looked recently. But in these books, Hennepin lays out in pretty good detail what happened on La Salle's journey of exploration and his version of what happened to the Griffin as well, which jives very closely to that of La Salle. What's interesting about these books is that in them, Hennepin claims that it wasn't La Salle who first descended the Mississippi, but it was he who descended the Mississippi first. And it's a really incredible claim, and it was immediately debunked by people, even back in the day. And so the books became sort of infamous because they're full of sort of exaggerations and self-promotion by Hennepin. And they ultimately cost Hennepin his reputation. And he was essentially evicted from his native Belgium. He sought asylum in Britain for the King of England. where he eventually published these books in English, which is why they're the ones you primarily know about when you hear about writings about the Griffin. You probably don't know about La Salle's original letters. Eventually, he fell out of favor with the British court too. He sought asylum in the end with in the Papal States, where he died in 1704. And that becomes significant when I'm going to talk about the next book. Remember that Hennepin died in 1704 in Italy. So these books are very interesting. They're in nice shape. They contain the original facsimile maps that came with the original, as well as all the plates. They're on uncut, handmade paper. They're beautiful books. Hennepin's New Discovery in America. These were essentially annotated by Reuben Goldthwaites, the Secretary of the State Historical Society of Wisconsin during the 1800s. And you can get copies of these for a few hundred to maybe $400 a set. The next book, though, is probably the most interesting, and this is the original 1698 version of this book. This was published in England for the King of England, and I'm going to show you images of a lot of these. What you'll see about this particular book is that it's written in the old English style, and it's filthy from many years of handling, but it's called A New Discovery of a Vast Country in America, extending about 4,000 miles between New France and New Mexico, with a description of the Great Lakes, cataracts, rivers, plants, and animals. Also, the manners, customs, and languages of the several native Indians and the advantage of commerce with those different nations. That's quite a title. It actually goes on further than that. But what's interesting about this is that it's actually both of these books all contained in one volume. It's holding up pretty well for its age. It's in decent shape. I primarily make use of these when I do research, but I'll read to you from this a little bit about what Hennepin has to say about the Griffin. And I should tell you, this is considered probably the least accurate account. This was written in 1698, well after the Griffin was lost, many years in fact, 19 years later, whereas the original LaSalle letter was written 1 year after the Griffin was lost. So, he says, Monsieur LaSalle, without asking anybody's advice, resolved to send back his ship to Niagara, laden with furs and skins to discharge his debts. Our pilot and 5 men with him were therefore sent back and ordered to return with all imaginable speed to join us toward the southern parts of the lake, where they should stay for them among the Illinois. Those are the Illinois Indians. They sailed on the 18th of September with a westerly wind, and fired a gun to take their leave. Though the wind was favorable, it was never known what course they steered, nor how they perished. For after all the inquiries we've been able to make, we could never learn anything else but the following particulars. And he takes this directly out of LaSalle's letter, although it's heavily paraphrased. LaSalle gives considerably more detail. The ship came to anchor to the north of the lake of the Illinois, which is Lake Michigan, where she was seen by some savages, who told us that they advised our men to sail along the coast and not towards the middle of the lake because of the sands that make navigation dangerous when there is any high wind. Our pilot, as I said before, was dissatisfied and would steer as he pleased without hearkening to the advice of the savages, who generally speaking have more sense than the Europeans think at first. But the ship was hardly a league from the coast when it was tossed up by a violent storm in such a manner that our men were never heard of since, and it is supposed that the ship struck upon a sand and was there buried. This was a great loss for Monsieur LaSalle and the other adventurers, for that ship, with its cargo, cost above 60,000 livres. This will seem incredible to many, but not to those who will consider that the rigging, anchors, and goods were brought by canoes from Quebec to Fort Frontenac, which is such a vast charge that the carriage of every hundredweight, either of anchors, cables, and the like, cost 11 livres. So it's quite an interesting account from Hennepin, and I really like having the original volume, both volumes. It's got some really beautiful fold-out plates in it in their original engravings, first generation woodcut engravings. One of the engravings, though, that's not in this book is the engraving of the building and of the construction of the Griffin, which many of you will have seen. There's a reason why it's not in here, and that's because that plate never appeared in this book until a much later printing in 1704. And therein lies the rub, because by 1704, when that book was printed and that plate was engraved, Father Hennepin was already dead. One wonders if Father Hennepin indeed had any input into that now famous plate of the building of the Griffin. And there are some reasons to question that, because if you look in here, you know, he has the beautiful engraving of the Falls of Niagara, which is quite accurate, actually, to where the way Niagara Falls really look. But if you look at the plate of the building of the Griffin, it has palm trees in the background and mountains. As you know, the Griffin was built in present-day Buffalo, New York. There are no palm trees or mountains. And so I believe, and I think academics tend to believe, that that plate was done without any input from Father Hennepin or anyone else who was present, and that it was solely done by an engraver who felt that it was one of the more colorful parts of the book and deserved an engraving of its own. And so many scholars have based their opinions about what the Griffin looked like on that woodcut engraving. And I think that it's largely been impeached that probably didn't have any input from anybody who actually saw the Griffin being built. And so that plate is not present in the original 1698 edition. It didn't appear until 1704, immediately after Hennepin's death. And I should say, too, Hennepin was gone from England and from Amsterdam for a number of years before that book was ever even laid out. So he couldn't have had input into that. Anyway, the original 1698, New Discovery of a Vast Country in America, from my collection. Very excited to have this particular book. I'll close by saying that this isn't Hennepin's only book. He wrote another book called Description of Louisiana in 1683, quite a bit earlier than this. And that was his first book, and it's much more credible than this. He didn't make any unsubstantiable claims. He did not try to usurp Lascelles' glory for being the first person to descend the Mississippi. And the 1683 claim, or book, I'm sorry, by Hennepin is actually more authoritative. I don't have it in original. I've got a pretty early reprint of it. But that book is noteworthy in that it literally reprints Lascelles' account in his letters, almost word for word. So, many of these letters of Lascelles that are in Margry's set have never been translated into English. I did translate the ones about the Griffin, and they're the subject of a number of talks that I give. Very interesting set of books, very difficult to obtain, and this, of course, is also quite difficult to obtain. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you enjoyed seeing an original 1698 copy of Father Hennepin's New Discovery in a Vast Country in America. Thanks so much for joining me.